Once was a king and a queen. Their greatest treasure was their son. What a boy. Not only was he handsome and smart and athletic, he was also kind and generous. And he had a sense of humor. He was a treasure, and they loved him so. Now, one day, the boy came down to the royal dining room, and he was moving his head back and forth like this. Son, is there something wrong with your neck? Shall I call for the royal doctor? No, mother. This is the way roosters always move their necks. And then he put his hands back like this, and he crowed. Well, the king looked at the queen, and the queen looked at the king, and they smiled. If their son, the prince, wanted to pretend he was a rooster, why not? But they didn't know. No, they didn't know how far this would go. For the next day, when the boy came down to breakfast, he insisted, I want corn and grain like all the other roosters. And when the plate came into the royal dining room, he threw the contents under the table, and then, to the horror of his parents, he took off all his clothes until he was in his altogether nothingness. He went under the table, and there he pecked at the corn and grain and crowed, "Arr, arr, 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 arr." This went on all day. And by the dinner, the parents had had it. Son, enough. You've got to come out from under the table. It's time to eat your dinner. It's time to take a bath. Put on your pajamas. But the boy refused. He was a rooster, and he was going to stay under the table. So the parents called for the royal doctor. He examined the boy. He could find nothing wrong. So the king and the queen called in all the experts in the town. They called in nurses and teachers and anybody they could think of, but nobody could cure the prince. So they put out a worldwide proclamation, and people came with lotions and potions and chants, but no one could cure the prince. The days went by, the weeks and months, and finally the king and queen had to admit that it was hopeless. No one could cure the prince, and so they told their servants to admit no one regarding this matter. Well, one day, there was a knock on the door. And when the servant opened it, there was an old man with a long white beard and dark piercing eyes. I've come to cure the prince. Haven't you heard? The servant said. The king and the queen will admit no one regarding this matter. It's hopeless. And the door was shut in the old man's face. The next day, there was a knock on the door. And when the servant opened it, there was the old man. I've come to cure the prince. I told you yesterday that the king and queen will see no one regarding this matter. And he went to shut the door. But the old man put his hand out and said, wait, please, I have a message for the king and the queen. Tell them that sometimes in order to help a friend, a man must step into the mud. Well, the servant didn't know what this meant. So he went and he told the king and the queen. And they didn't know what it meant either, but they decided to let the man in. When the old man was brought into the royal dining room, he went straight to the table. And then, everyone, he took off all his clothes, so he was in his altogether nothingness. He crouched down and went under the table. The prince looked at him. Who are you? Why, I'm a rooster just like you. And then he crowed. Arr, 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 arr. All that day, the old man remained under the table, pecking at the corn and grain alongside the prince. And you know, it had been so long that the prince had been by himself, he didn't realize how lonely he'd become. It was nice to have a companion. But the next day, the old man stood up and he stretched. Wait a minute, cried the prince. Roosters don't stand up. Roosters don't stretch. The old man smiled. I know I'm a rooster, and you know I'm a rooster, but my back hurts. It feels good to stretch. Why don't you try it? The prince did, and it did feel good. The next day, the old man asked for some clothes, and when they came, he put them on. Wait a minute, cried the prince. Roosters don't wear clothes. The old man smiled and said, I know I'm a rooster, and you know I'm a rooster, but it's cold in here. Clothes feel good. Why don't you try it? So the prince asked for some of his clothes, and his clothes were not ordinary clothes. They were made out of the finest silk and satin and velvet, and they did feel good. And the next day, the old man asked for a plate of people food, and when it came, he put it on the table and sat down. Wait a minute, cried the prince. Roosters don't eat people food. And you know what the old man said. I know rooster, and you know I'm a rooster, but to tell you the truth, that corn and grain is boring. I'm sick of eating it. People food's much better. Why don't you try it? And so the prince asked for some people food. It was brought and put on the table. He sat across from his parents. It had been so long since he had talked to his parents, he'd forgotten how funny they were, how smart they were. He had a wonderful time, and as for that food, it was delicious. After the meal, the old man said, it's time for me to go, but I want to tell you a secret. You can walk like a person and talk like a person and eat like a person and still be a good rooster inside. Oh, said the prince. And from that day on, he walked like a person and talked like a person and ate like a person. And in time, he grew up and he became the king. He was a very, very good king. But if you happen to be near the palace early in the morning, you just might hear him crow.